The Pentagon's rooftop gleamed under the dying sun. What began as a routine inspection would soon become a story whispered through every military hall. The Secretary of Defense, confident, untouchable, decided to amuse himself at the expense of a quiet soldier polishing a helicopter's console. "Fly this helicopter," he joked, "and I'll marry you." The officers laughed, but when she looked up, her calm silence carried more authority than any man there. No one knew her name yet. No one knew what she had done or what she had lost. But within minutes, the woman they mocked would command the sky itself and expose a truth powerful enough to bring the nation's most arrogant man to his knees. If you believe courage still matters more than rank, subscribe right now. These are not just stories. They're mirrors of real strength, honor, and redemption. Because when pride challenges integrity, it's not power that wins. It's the silence that follows. The wind swept across the Pentagon's rooftop helipad, carrying the low hum of distant engines and the golden haze of late afternoon. A group of high-ranking officers stood near a brand-new tactical helicopter, their laughter mixing with the rhythmic whir of the maintenance crew below. At the center, Secretary of Defense Richard Halvorsen, polished shoes, expensive suit, the weight of authority in every gesture, surveyed the scene like a man who believed the world itself saluted him. He spotted her, a female soldier adjusting the control panel with methodical precision. Her uniform was plain, marked only by the rank of private. "You there," Halvorsen called, voice sharp. "Think you could handle something like this?" She turned calmly, eyes steady, offering no immediate answer. The officers nearby exchanged smirks. To them, this was entertainment. To her, it was a test she hadn't asked for. Halvorsen stepped closer, the corners of his mouth curling into arrogance. "Fly this helicopter," he said, pausing for effect, "and I'll marry you." The laughter erupted instantly, bouncing off the steel walls of the helipad. Yet, in that storm of mockery, she didn't flinch. Her expression remained unreadable, composed, quiet, unyielding. Then came the silence that unsettled everyone. She raised her chin slightly and asked, "Is that an order, sir?" The air changed. Officers straightened. Even Halvorsen hesitated. Something in her tone wasn't defiant. It was disciplined, controlled. The laughter died in throats that suddenly remembered hierarchy. Halvorsen forced a grin, trying to reclaim the moment. "Relax, soldier. It's a joke," he said, his voice slipping between command and discomfort. But the damage was done. The remark had turned on him like a boomerang, an invisible wound to his pride. Her eyes lingered on his, sharp yet strangely patient, as if she had seen this arrogance before and learned to live above it. Colonel Mason Reeves watched from a few steps away, studying her. He recognized the posture, the poise, not a recruit, but of someone who had seen battle, loss, and command. He said nothing, but the faint tightening of his jaw revealed an unease. "She's no rookie," he whispered under his breath, unheard by anyone else. As the group dispersed slightly, Halvorsen called after her again. "What's your name, soldier?" "Sarah Callahan," she replied evenly, her voice cutting through the fading chatter. Mason's head snapped up. The name landed heavy, one he hadn't heard in years, one that shouldn't exist anymore. But before he could speak, Sarah had already turned back to the helicopter. She brushed her hand across the cold metal surface, as if greeting an old friend. The camera would linger there, the faint reflection of her eyes in the steel fuselage. Beneath her calm exterior, memories stirred. Flames, smoke, the sound of rotors, and the silence that follows when no one comes back. And then, just as Halvorsen smirked and walked away, she whispered under her breath, "Permission to prove you wrong, sir." The faint whir of blades in the distance answered her, a sound that promised the story had only begun. Sarah's hands moved with surgical precision as she continued checking the helicopter's console. Every flick of a switch, every glance at a gauge revealed experience that didn't match her rank. Around her, the officers whispered, trading smirks and comments that floated like gnats in the air. The Secretary of Defense stood nearby, arms crossed, waiting for her to make a mistake. But she didn't. Her silence was heavier than their mockery, and somehow it made him uneasy. Colonel Mason Reeves lingered near the edge of the helipad, his eyes never leaving her. The name Sarah Callahan echoed through his mind like a ghost. Years ago, he had read her name in a classified mission report, one that ended with presumed dead. He could almost hear the rotors of that night, the coded distress signals, the final transmission that vanished into static. And yet, here she was, alive, polishing a machine like it was a confession she couldn't speak aloud. Halvorsen cleared his throat loudly, snapping the tension. "Are we still waiting for takeoff clearance, Private?" he mocked, his tone dripping with condescension. Sarah turned slowly, her expression calm but her eyes sharp. "No, sir. I'm waiting for your permission." The words were respectful in form, but cutting in spirit. The other officers exchanged looks, sensing the shift in tone. It wasn't the response they expected from someone they thought was beneath him. Try to regain control. Halvorsen laughed, a little too loudly. "Then you have it, soldier. Permission granted. Let's see what you can do." The grin on his face betrayed arrogance, but beneath it flickered the smallest trace of doubt. Sarah nodded once, no hesitation. She stepped into the cockpit, the door shutting behind her with a crisp, echoing click. The sound sliced through the air like a verdict. Engines roared to life. The vibrations rolled through the steel deck, rattling the loose papers in the secretary's hand. One by one, the officers moved back as the rotors spun faster, blurring into a halo of power and memory. Inside, Sarah's breathing steadied. Her fingers found the controls, as though the years apart had never existed. "It's just you and me again," she murmured to the machine, her voice drowned by the thunder of blades. The helicopter lifted effortlessly, tilting with precision. Every maneuver was measured, flawless. Gasps replaced laughter. The secretary's smug grin evaporated as the aircraft executed a perfect turn against the wind, holding an altitude only seasoned pilots could manage. Mason's pulse quickened. He recognized every motion, every formation. It was the signature of Operation Nightfall, the mission that was never supposed to be mentioned again. "I've seen that flight pattern before," he whispered, voice trembling. On the ground, Halvorsen tried to keep his composure. "Probably just luck," he muttered, though his eyes betrayed him. The officers around him no longer looked at Sarah as a low-ranking soldier. Something sacred had entered the air, a mix of awe and guilt. In the control tower, even the technicians fell silent, their monitors glowing as if witnessing history. The entire helipad had become a stage for justice disguised as routine inspection. As the helicopter descended gracefully, the sound of rotors fading, the audience held its breath. Sarah stepped out, posture straight, her face unreadable. The silence was thick, reverent. Then, without a word, she reached into her jacket and pulled out a sealed folder marked classified. She walked toward Halvorsen, her boots striking the deck with the rhythm of a drum roll. The first line of the twist was already written in her calm. She wasn't here to prove herself. She was here to remind him what true authority looks like. The folder in Sarah's hand was heavy, not in weight, but in consequence. The red stamp reading classified seemed to pulse under the sunlight as she stopped before the Secretary of Defense. The air was silent except for the faint hum of cooling rotors. Halvorsen forced a grin, trying to mask the discomfort twisting inside him. "What's this? Another maintenance report?" he asked, voice brittle. Sarah met his gaze, calm and steady. "No, sir. It's your education." Gasps rippled quietly through the officers, standing nearby. She opened the folder and placed it on the hood of the vehicle beside them. Inside were documents, photographs, and commendations, each stamped with the same signature, Major Sarah Callahan. The title alone froze Halvorsen where he stood. His smirk faltered, the color draining from his face. One photo showed a younger Sarah in flight gear, standing beside a downed helicopter and wounded soldiers she had pulled from the wreckage. A Medal of Valor recommendation lay clipped to the corner. Mason Reeves stepped closer, eyes locked on the image. "It can't be," he whispered, barely audible. His throat tightened as he recalled the operation. Operation Nightfall. The mission that went wrong because of bad intelligence from Halvorsen's office. Sarah had saved dozens, but vanished before she could testify. She was declared dead to protect a cover-up that made powerful men untouchable. Now one of them stood before her. The silence around the helipad became suffocating. Halvorsen's lips moved, but no words came. This isn't possible, he muttered, flipping to the papers as if denial could rewrite history. The truth stared back with brutal clarity. Timestamps, coordinates, signatures, all leading to him. Sarah didn't gloat. She stood motionless, letting the evidence speak. For years, she had carried that silence, waiting for the moment when her truth would meet his pride head-on. Finally, she spoke. "You said if I could fly this helicopter, you'd marry me." Her tone was cold steel. "But I'd never marry a man who ran from the wreckage and called it leadership." The words hit harder than any slap. The officer's eyes widened. Mason's jaw clenched. For the first time, Halvorsen looked small, a man cornered not by guns or rank, but by truth. Mason took a step forward, voice deep and resonant. "Sir," he said, each syllable heavy with disgust, "you just mocked a legend." The statement sliced through the tension like a blade. The watching officers didn't laugh now. Their silence was collective judgment, and Halvorsen could feel it pressing against him like gravity. His polished image cracked with every heartbeat. Halvorsen tried to salvage authority, his voice trembling. You don't understand what politics demands." But no one listened. Sarah simply saluted him, a gesture precise, respectful, but final. "Permission to be dismissed, sir." That simple request carried the weight of everything he had taken from her. She turned, boots echoing on the steel deck, and began to walk away. The minister's legs gave out. Knees struck the ground with a dull thud. Papers scattered in the wind like broken promises. He bowed his head, not to her rank, but to her courage. Around them, no one spoke. Mason lowered his gaze, the moment carving itself into memory. And as Sarah reached the edge of the helipad, the fading sun caught her silhouette. Calm, resolute, untouchable. Justice, it seemed, had learned to walk in silence. The last rays of sunlight stretched across the Pentagon's rooftop, painting the helipad in shades of gold and crimson. The sound of the helicopter's rotors had faded, leaving behind a silence so profound it seemed to echo. Sarah stopped at the edge of the platform, her figure outlined against the horizon. The wind tugged gently at her uniform, carrying away the tension that had gripped the air minutes earlier. Behind her, the most powerful man in the defense chain remained on his knees, humbled, small, and wordless. Colonel Mason Reeves approached slowly, his steps deliberate, respectful. He didn't speak. There was nothing to add. He simply stood beside Halvorsen for a moment, eyes fixed on Sarah's departing silhouette. "That's what leadership looks like," he finally said, his voice barely more than a breath. The secretary's eyes lifted, glassy and unfocused. In that instant, Halvorsen understood the weight of his failure. Not as an official, but as a man who had mistaken pride for strength. Sarah reached for the silver wings pinned beneath her collar and unclipped them carefully. For a second, she stared at them, the symbol that had once defined her and condemned her to silence. She placed them gently atop a crate near the helipad's edge. It wasn't surrender, it was closure. The wings gleamed briefly in the sunset, reflecting not defeat but freedom. Mason watched quietly, realizing that her final act wasn't defiance. It was release. Halvorsen rose slowly, his knees shaking, his breath uneven. He took one uncertain step forward, the weight of guilt anchoring him. "Major Callahan," he began, but the words broke. He had no right to her title, nor the forgiveness that came with it. She turned slightly, her expression unreadable yet calm. "Sir," she said softly, "some debts aren't paid with words." Her tone wasn't vengeful, it was almost merciful. And then she turned back toward the horizon. The camera would linger on Halvorsen's trembling hand as he reached out but stopped short, fingers curling into a fist. Mason stepped between them, his voice steady. "Let her go, sir. You can't salute someone standing above you." It was more than a line, it was a verdict. Halvorsen nodded weakly, tears mixing with the light of the setting sun. The arrogance that had once defined him dissolved into a kind of fragile humanity. Below, the officers still stood in silence. Not one dared to move. What had begun as mockery had ended as a ceremony of respect no one planned. Sarah's steps grew softer with distance until they were swallowed by the hum of city traffic far below. In that vanishing figure, Every soldier present saw something they've forgotten. The kind of courage that doesn't shout, doesn't demand, but simply endures. Mason picked up the discarded folder, closing it gently. He glanced toward the sky and murmured, "For those who flew and never returned." Then, in one final gesture, he saluted, not to the Secretary of Defense, but to Sarah Callahan. Halvorsen followed, lowering his head in silence. The gesture spread, one by one, across the helipad until the entire command stood frozen in wordless unity. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the helipad fell into twilight. The wind lifted the classified folder from Mason's hands, scattering its pages across the air like fragments of history finally freed from their secrecy. As the last page fluttered past Halvorsen's shoulder, he whispered, "Forgive my blindness." The sound barely carried, but Mason heard it, and so did the audience. The final shot followed Sarah descending the metal stairs, fading into shadow. The narrator's voice echoed softly, "Sometimes silence is the loudest salute." The screen lingered on her name, engraved in a metal's reflection, before fading to black. If this story moved you, take a moment to honor real heroes who serve in silence. Subscribe for more powerful stories like this, tales of courage, redemption, and truth behind the uniform. And if you believe that integrity still matters in a world of noise, join our community and stand with us. More stories like this are already in flight. Don't miss the next revelation.